The Roman Empire, a name synonymous with glory, law, architecture, and conquest. Its triumphal arches still stand, its arenas still echo in our imagination, its legal codes form the skeleton of modern Western justice. But beneath the marble, behind the gold, there was another Rome, a Rome that history has intentionally forgotten, a Rome that ran on the silent suffering of those who had no voice. There existed a system, structured, profitable, and invisible, where human beings were not merely enslaved, they were conditioned, displayed, and consumed. Not women, not prostitutes, boys, many not yet 13, taken, trained, owned, male concubines, children purchased to serve the elite in ways the law refused to name. Their stories are missing from monuments. Their suffering was wrapped in silk and silenced by power. This is not mythology, this is not exaggeration, this is history, the part that was never meant to be remembered. Part 1. Behind the mask of civilization. Every civilization has a price. In the case of ancient Rome, so often hailed as the pinnacle of law, architecture, and philosophical reason, the cost extended far beyond conquest, bloodshed, and plundered gold. It was paid, in part, through the stolen childhoods and broken bodies of thousands of boys. Boys without names, without rights, without a voice, transformed into sexual property, consumed quietly by Rome's most powerful elite. Civilization, or the cosmetics of power. Ancient Rome is remembered for its emphasis on rationality, order, and civic virtue. But these ideals were reserved for a privileged few, freeborn male citizens of proper status. Everyone else, women, foreigners, slaves, children, fell outside the moral framework. They weren't seen as full humans, but as instruments, tools for labor, pleasure, or display. Within this worldview, a young boy from Gaul or Greece, beautiful and obedient, was not seen as a person, but as a luxury object, a living ornament of his master's wealth and taste. Where law ends, abuse begins. Roman law was elaborate in its protection of property, contracts, and citizen rights. But when it came to enslaved children used for sexual purposes, it offered no recognition, no protection, and no language. To the law, these boys were not victims. They were res, things. And things, by definition, cannot be raped. They cannot be violated. They cannot seek justice. This legal invisibility made possible a systematic form of abuse without consequence. A system that could be hidden in plain sight beneath silk robes and marble walls. A system by design, not accident. The use of young male concubines in Rome wasn't a cultural quirk or individual vice. It was an institutional mechanism with clear economic and social logic. Acquisition, boys were captured from conquered provinces or sold into slavery by desperate families. Selection, traits like youth, fair skin, delicate features, and exotic origin increased value. Greek boys were prized for refinement, northern boys for their physical beauty. Training, much like gladiators were trained for combat, these boys were trained for submission, taught how to walk, speak, entertain, and please. Possession. Once purchased, a concubine was no longer a child. He became an extension of his master, a human accessory, to be dressed, groomed, and displayed. The mechanics of erasure. What makes this system especially insidious is how thoroughly it erased its victims. They weren't written into family records. They weren't buried with honors. They weren't named in epics or biographies. Even in Roman literature and philosophy, so preoccupied with justice and morality, the concubine is a ghost. When mentioned at all, it is in vague euphemisms, well-kept, delicate, pleasing, never abused, violated, destroyed. This was a violence not of noise but of silence, not public spectacle but private normalization, so entrenched it became invisible even to itself. A society built for the powerful, not the ethical. Rome built aqueducts, roads, laws, and libraries. But it also built a moral system that excused the complete consumption of human bodies, so long as those bodies belonged to the voiceless. This is not an anomaly. This is not a footnote. This is the foundation. And it forces us to ask, can a civilization truly be called great if its glory was built on the silence of those it crushed? Part 2. Training and control, the systematic breaking of a human being. No one is born obedient. To turn a child into an object, compliant, silent, performative, requires more than chains. It requires method. In ancient Rome, the grooming of male concubines followed a disturbingly sophisticated process designed not only to condition the body, but to dismantle the mind. The deconstruction of self, the transformation began the moment a boy was purchased. He was stripped of clothing, of name, of memory. He was no longer someone's son, no longer part of a village, a tribe, a language. He became a blank slate, to be reshaped according to the desires of his owner. This was not random violence, it was strategic dehumanization. Concubines were taught to suppress their instincts, to mask discomfort with charm, to anticipate commands before they were spoken, to perform gratitude for every privilege, food, shelter, touch. In short, they were trained not just to serve, but to appear willing. Psychological conditioning as a tool of control. Owners and trainers employed tactics that would today be recognized as psychological abuse and manipulation. Isolation. Boys were kept away from others, especially those who spoke their native tongue. Any bond that might foster solidarity or resistance was severed. Reward and withdrawal. Moments of affection, gifts, or praise were given unpredictably, only to be withdrawn as punishment. This created dependency and confusion. Surveillance. Their movements, words, even facial expressions were monitored. Smiles became survival tools, not reflections of joy. Some concubines were taught philosophy, literature, and music, but only insofar as it increased their value as living entertainment. Knowledge was never freedom. It was another costume of refinement, something to be performed, not lived. The body as property physical control was just as meticulous as psychological conditioning. Diet and exercise, regimens were enforced to maintain a youthful, slender figure. Cosmetic alteration, some were subjected to depilation, bleaching, even primitive surgical procedures to meet aesthetic preferences. Dress and ornamentation, silk robes, perfumes, jewelry, these adorned the concubine not as gifts, but as proofs of ownership. They were walking trophies of wealth and taste. Behind the opulence was pain. These bodies did not belong to the boys inhabiting them. They belonged to the whims of another, to be touched, dressed, reshaped, or discarded at will. Repetition, ritual, ruin. This was not a one-time breaking. It was a cycle, repeated daily, weekly, yearly, until the boy internalized the role. Over time, many no longer remembered what resistance felt like. Some forgot their native languages. Some developed coping mechanisms, rituals of detachment, self-denial, even humor to survive. But no mask lasts forever. The psychological fractures ran deep. Dissociation, depression, trauma responses we would now identify as complex PTSD. And yet, in Rome, these were invisible wounds. There was no vocabulary for what they suffered, only silence. Efficiency in invisibility. The brilliance and horror of the Roman concubine system lay in its efficiency. It didn't require visible chains. It didn't need public punishments. It functioned by engineering the mind, by reshaping the victim until he no longer believed he had the right to say no. In a society obsessed with control, conquest, and hierarchy, this was the ultimate domination. Not just to own a person's body, but to erase his belief that he had ever owned it himself. Part 3. Life in the Gilded Cage. Shards behind marble walls. Not all prisons have bars. Some are furnished in silk, scented with perfume, and lit by candlelight. The lives of male concubines in elite Roman households were often surrounded by opulence. But that luxury came at a devastating cost. The complete erasure of autonomy, identity, and hope. The illusion of privilege. To outsiders, these boys might have appeared favored, even lucky. They lived in private chambers, wore fine clothing, and had access to education in literature, music, and rhetoric. Some were seen dining with their masters, even participating in salons and banquets. But this was not privilege, it was presentation. A carefully staged illusion designed to conceal the truth, that these children were living props, groomed to reflect their owner's sophistication, trained to flatter and entertain, required to always smile. Their physical appearance was micromanaged, their behavior was curated. Every glance, every gesture, every spoken word was part of a performance that never ended. A life without time, without ownership. A concubine's time did not belong to him. He was expected to be available at all hours, summoned at a whim. Even his rest was conditional. Even his silence was observed. Concubines could not refuse physical contact, object to commands, leave their quarters without permission, form bonds with others without fear of retaliation. What looked like a life of indulgence was in reality a state of permanent surveillance and anticipated servitude. Social isolation and internal hierarchies. The pain wasn't only physical, it was also socially engineered. Other household slaves often viewed male concubines with contempt or envy, seeing them as either spoiled or debased. Freeborn members of the household treated them as decorative amusements, not as human beings. Concubines lived in a liminal space, too privileged to belong to the slaves, too owned to belong to the family. This isolation was strategic. It prevented solidarity, ensured emotional dependence, and reinforced the idea that only the master's approval mattered. In homes with multiple concubines, competition was often cultivated. They were pitted against one another for favor, creating a toxic atmosphere of mistrust, betrayal, and fear. No future, no exit. Most concubines had no pathway to freedom. They were not trained in trades. They owned nothing. They had no legal personhood. Their entire identity was constructed around serving and pleasing, a role that expired as soon as their youth or beauty faded. When that time came, many were sold to lesser households, assigned to menial labor, abandoned altogether. The transition was brutal. A former concubine, now seen as used, often had no means of surviving on his own. His body, once valued for pleasure, was now dismissed as waste. Very few escaped. Even fewer lived to reclaim a life with dignity. The cage was never just physical. The most tragic aspect of the concubine's existence wasn't just the abuse or the control, it was the systematic destruction of the self. A childhood rewritten, a soul trained to smile through pain, a human being turned into a mirror for another's vanity. These boys lived not in their own stories, but in the fantasies of their masters. They were expected to be beautiful but invisible, educated but voiceless, adorned but erased. Their lives existed between glances, between commands, between punishments and rewards, never truly their own. Part 4: Resistance, Despair, and the Forgotten Years. No system of domination is total without fear, and no life under absolute control is lived without moments, brief, flickering, of defiance. For some male concubines in ancient Rome, submission was never complete, not because they had power, but because they still remembered what it meant to want freedom. Desperate acts of resistance escape was nearly impossible. Masters spared no effort in ensuring absolute containment, psychological, physical, and social. Yet some concubines tried. They slipped away during festivals or travel, sought refuge among sympathetic slaves or foreigners, attempted to end their own lives. Most were caught, and punishment was designed not merely to hurt, but to warn. Those who fled were publicly whipped, mutilated, or paraded in chains before being returned to their master's home. Their fate was rarely death. Death would be too merciful. Instead, they were kept alive to serve as living examples of failure, a walking deterrent for others who might dream of escape. Suicide, the final protest. Some concubines saw only one way out, death on their own terms. But even this was often denied. Masters who had paid dearly for their property took steps to prevent suicide, including removing sharp objects, assigning constant surveillance, punishing even failed attempts with starvation or public humiliation. Those who succeeded were often buried in unmarked graves. Their stories ended in silence, but the act itself, the refusal to be owned one moment longer, was perhaps the clearest rejection of a system built on ownership. Aging in captivity. When beauty fades, there was no future for a concubine. Once a boy lost the traits that made him desirable, youth, softness, innocence, his value plummeted. Many were sold to harsher masters in rural provinces, relegated to manual labor alongside other slaves. abandoned, left to survive in a society that offered no safety net, no identity, and no sympathy. The psychological fallout was immense. They had spent their formative years performing submission, erasing their own desires, and depending entirely on a master's favor. When that favor vanished, so did any remaining structure of their world. They were no longer concubines, but neither were they free. The rare survivors. A few, very few, managed to gain freedom. Some were manumitted as acts of sentimentality by aging masters. Others saved enough to buy themselves back. Fewer still reinvented themselves, moving to distant provinces or assuming false identities to escape their past. These survivors rarely spoke of their experiences, not because they lacked the words, but because no one wanted to hear them. To Roman society, their story had no place, and to themselves, the memory was both a curse and a miracle, proof that they had endured the unimaginable, but never unscarred. The cruelty of obsolescence. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of the concubine system was not what it did during youth, but what it left behind afterward. It left men who had never been taught to choose, had never experienced genuine affection, had never seen their own reflection outside the desires of another. The system did not merely use them, it unwrote them until there was nothing left to return to and nothing ahead to walk toward. Part 5. Cultural Amnesia. When history chose silence, history is not written by the victors, it is written by those who control the ink. And in ancient Rome, that ink flowed from the pens of philosophers, senators, poets, and patricians, none of whom saw fit to remember the boys they consumed. Philosophy and the hypocrisy of virtue. Roman intellectual life was rich with discussions of ethics, virtue, and duty. Thinkers like Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius wrote at length about justice, temperance, and the ideal life. But these philosophies applied almost exclusively to free men citizens. Those deemed worthy of moral consideration, the concubine, by contrast, was excluded by definition. His suffering did not count because his existence itself was deemed peripheral, ornamental, expendable. How could a boy be a victim if he was never considered fully human? This is how a culture rationalizes cruelty, not by denying it, but by making its subjects invisible in the moral equation. Law without protection. Roman law was obsessively detailed: contracts, inheritance, land disputes, military codes. But when it came to concubines, it spoke in euphemisms or not at all. There were no statutes against their sexual exploitation, no legal recognition of their trauma, no mechanisms for complaint or redress. They existed in a legal vacuum, a gray zone between slavery, servitude, and objecthood. The law protected them only as property, not as people. And when a person is only protected as a thing, any harm short of destruction is technically legal. Architecture of silence, the great monuments of Rome, its villas, baths, palaces, were built and maintained by those with no voice. Among them, concubines served in the shadows behind tapestries under command. They touched the marble, but their names were never etched into it. They inhabited the empire, but were never meant to be part of its memory. Even Roman literature, which relished scandal and sexuality, rarely described these relationships with honesty. When concubines appeared in poems or plays, they were reduced to nameless caricatures, fetishized for their youth or foreignness, rendered as punchlines, never people. Why forget? Rome remembered what made it look powerful. It forgot what made that power possible. To remember the concubine would be to admit complicity, to acknowledge that pleasure and civilization were built on the backs and bodies of those who could not say no. So it erased them, and we, inheriting Rome's monuments, its laws, even its language, inherited its silences too. Why it still matters. The story of the Roman concubine is not ancient history. It is a mirror, reflecting what societies are willing to forget to preserve their image. It forces us to ask, whose pain do we normalize today? Whose voices do we still ignore because they make us uncomfortable? What systems of beauty, status, or pleasure still demand silent victims? To remember these boys is not to sensationalize their suffering. It is to restore them to the human record, not as objects of pity, but as warnings. Warnings about how easily a civilization can justify the unjust, and how easily silence becomes tradition. Part 6, Epilogue. Restoring stolen memory. Behind every forgotten life is a choice made by those with the power to forget, and the power to be remembered. They were not gladiators, not generals, not emperors. They were children, stripped of identity and reshaped for someone else's pleasure. Not honored in stone, not buried in family tombs, not named in any scrolls. And yet they existed. Their breaths filled Roman villas, their footsteps echoed in marble halls. Their suffering funded the performances of power, beauty, and empire. To remember them now is not revisionism. It is resistance against centuries of selective memory and moral convenience. Memory as justice history cannot offer reparations. It cannot rewind time or unwrite wounds, but it can acknowledge. It can witness. It can rescue voices from beneath the ruins and say, "You were here." That act alone is an antidote to the silence that allowed such cruelty to thrive. The present echoes the past. Though the names have changed, the dynamics remain familiar. Today we still see systems that reward silence and punish truth, institutions that exploit vulnerability for profit, cultures that celebrate beauty but ignore the cost behind it. To speak of Roman concubines is to ask, who are we forgetting now, and who benefits from that forgetting? The price of civilization. Every empire builds monuments. Few build memory for those crushed beneath them. Rome gave the world its roads, its laws, its architecture. But beneath every triumphal arch, there are bones no one counted, and among them, the small and quiet bones of those who were never meant to be known. We cannot undo what was done, but we can refuse to look away. Because remembering is not weakness, it is a declaration that suffering matters, that silence is never neutral, and that even the most invisible lives belong in history. They were boys, they were human, they were erased. Now, at last, we speak their names, not because we knew them, but because they should have been known all along.